there's chemical digestion. So chewing is physical. The amylase and other salivary enzymes working on the food that you're chewing is the beginning of chemical digestion. Okay? So, chemical digestion and physical digestion are going to happen. When you take a bite of, let's say, a burger and you chew it up, that mouthful that you're going to swallow is called a bolus. B-O-L-U-S. Basically a wad of food that you swallow. And as it travels, it's still a bolus as it goes down the esophagus, and we'll explain what it turns into later on. So, you chew up that bolus of food, salivary enzymes start to break down various components, you swallow it, and the next thing that ball of food or the bolus is going to pass through is called your pharynx. Okay? Pharynx, I think pharynx sounds like F for funnel. It is basically a funnel-shaped structure that is where your nasal passages and your oral cavity come together. Okay? So, has anyone ever used one of those neti pot things? You know what I'm talking about? Yes. Mm-hmm. The little, you squeeze it and the water goes in your nose, out the other side, out your mouth, and every other which way. They're gross. Yeah, they're disgusting. But the idea is that you can squeeze water in your nose and it comes out your mouth. That's because they're both connected via the pharynx. All right? So your nose and mouth holes come together into one tube that collectively, that coming together part is the pharynx. And then they are going to split off into either your trachea or your esophagus. Okay. So you see there are two tubes here. There's this one and this one. Which one of these do you think would be the trachea, the air tube?
The hard one.
This one. It's rigid. It's open. It makes sense that you wouldn't want a flappy tube that could collapse on itself to make sure that you have airflow. So that by process of elimination, this next one, the one in the back in an anatomical position. So in reality, this would be oriented like this. Your airway is in the front. Your esophagus is behind it. The esophagus is this flappy tube. It's made up of 2 layers of smooth muscle. Why do you think that's important? Why do you need muscle in your esophagus?
Push it down.
Push it down. What's the pushing down process named? Same thing that pushes food through your intestines. Starts with a P. Peristalsis. There you go. So we said 2 layers of smooth muscle in the esophagus. This is the tube of the esophagus. You have some parallel fibers that run this way, and you have transverse fibers that run this way. Basically, you alternate contractions. You squeeze it, make it shorter. Squeeze it this way, clamp it off. Squeeze it, make it shorter again. Alternate, rinse, lather, repeat. The net result is you are pushing food in one direction. The main and all that, it's the idea why you could take a bite of a hamburger standing on your head and not just have it sit right there. It's going to get pushed down through the actual peristaltic movements of the esophagus. This was pretty big. We had a 25-pounder last semester. It was huge.
Where y'all get these?
It's sad. Well, okay, I will go over that. Everyone always asks that. These cats come from a company called Carolina Biological. They are collected from humane societies and things like that where they have to put down stray cats. So it's not like they're running through neighborhoods baiting people's cats. I mean, they're stray animals. They're usually not coming out of very good situations. Sometimes they come in and they're very sick. They're just not in the best shape. They humanely put these things down, and they're used to teach people. They're used to teach vets, other scientists, so people could potentially save other cats. So
I know how old this corpse
they're
is.
dying, but they were going to die anyway. And if you can use its body to teach someone about how it died or how it lived. Cat Jesus, yeah, all right. Except he's not coming back, and if he does, we're gone. All right. So yeah, they are humanely euthanized. They had a story in the news recently about they wouldn't want to sell cats from the Lafayette shelter to places. I don't know. It's drama, but these are humanely euthanized. They're prepared, and it's all for science. So, okay, moving on. Your esophagus is here. It's going to continue through the thoracic cavity, through the diaphragm, right here, the diaphragm is this flap. Can you see that?
The flap.
The flap. The flap that separates your thoracic cavity from the abdominal cavity. This flap. It's not really a flap, it's kind of like
Just not that piece of tissue.
Is it thoracic cavity?
thoracic cavity, abdominal cavity. This separates the two. So you know what? You know what your diaphragm does beyond separate?
Oh, it compresses.
Yeah, it helps you breathe. So in reality, this would be all closed up. There'd be no leaks or anything in it. If I pulled down on this, the lungs are going to want to get bigger, and that's going to pull air in this way. Same idea as like when you get hiccups, spasms of the nerve that controls the diaphragm. But functionally, we're going to talk about the respiratory implications of the diaphragm next time. This time, it's just to show you that it's a boundary between the thoracic cavities and abdominal cavities. Okay? So, we'll go over some of these parts, but we're going to follow sort of in order. You can see that the esophagus continues down, and it's going to connect to the stomach right here.
So it stops right before the stomach?
Yes. Can you see? And if y'all can't see, let me know. I'll try and position this so everyone can get a view. So the esophagus is going to continue down through the diaphragm. It's going to connect to the stomach right here. There is a special valve right there that will open to let food into the stomach and close to keep the acid of the stomach in the stomach. That's called the cardiac valve. And you're thinking, why would you name it after the heart? I don't know, but this is how I remember it. If you have acid in your stomach get back out, you get heartburn. Okay? Heartburn is stopped by the working of the cardiac sphincter. All right? So, at this point, you have that bolus of food, your cardiac sphincter opens, the food enters the stomach, and then it's going to be mashed up into a mush that is called chyme. C-H-Y-M-E. So you go from food, chew it into a bolus. When it gets to the stomach, it's mashed into chyme. All right? So, in the stomach, you have, it's a very acidic environment. Everyone knows that, but you know what acid contributes to the acidity of the stomach? It's hydrochloric acid. Okay? The hydrochloric acid is produced by glands called gastric glands on the inside of the stomach. You can't see them as far as I understand. Just know that on the inside of the stomach there are glands that produce the hydrochloric acid. Okay? So, that food, or the stomach itself, the wall of the stomach is also made up of smooth muscle. The idea being that it's not necessarily meant to contract and pump things like in peristalsis. It's just, its job is to just kind of mash everything up. It contracts irregularly to make sure that that's all thoroughly mixed with the hydrochloric acid and the various enzymes and bile and whatnot. Okay? So, in the stomach, you have several other starts to chemical digestion that occur there. So, to begin with that, you have this big guy right here. What is this? This whole big thing.
Small
It's a liver. All right? The liver, what does the liver do? Do y'all know?
filters.
It filters, but its main goal is to produce bile. Okay? The liver produces the bile, and then the bile is stored in the gallbladder. You'll see this right here, this little green dot right there. This is the gallbladder. Okay? The gallbladder holds the bile until you take in a meal and it needs to be dumped into the stomach. So, does anyone know anyone that's had their gallbladder removed?
Yeah.
Yeah? You know, what are the implications of that? What kind of things can't you eat? Greasy foods, like greasy, fatty, spicy foods. Delicious foods. The problem being is that when you don't have your gallbladder, you're not producing bile. The job of the bile, like let's say you have breakfast and you got sausage and bacon and all the greasy stuff. And your body senses that when it gets to your stomach, and then it tells your gallbladder to dump the bile into the stomach. And then the bile is going to break down the fats. We're going to talk more about that in a sec, but it is not an enzyme. It's what's called a surfactant. Okay? When you think of surfactant, think of something similar to like what soap does. Okay? So if I cooked, let's say I cooked the bacon I ate, and I took the dirty pan with all the bacon grease, filled it with water. The grease is going to go up to the top, and it's going to clump together in little balls and bubbles, and it's not going to want to mix with the water. If I put a surfactant in there, like soap is a surfactant, you can, as soon as it hits the water, you see like a spreading across kind of a rainbow looking stuff. You know what I'm talking about. That surfactant changes the surface tension on the water, which makes it more likely for the water to bond with, or for the oil to bond with the water, instead of them staying to themselves. That physical motion, that moving that you would see in the greasy pan, is the force that breaks apart the fat molecules. It's not an enzyme because it's not it's used up, and it doesn't actually chemically alter the bonds. That spreading out force brought by introducing a surfactant actually physically pulls apart the molecules into smaller chunks. Okay? So at this point you have your chyme, which is being mashed up in the stomach. You've dumped in your bile, so you're breaking down your fats. You also have glands, or your gastric glands also produce an enzyme which is called pepsin. Okay? Pepsin sounds like protein.
What produces that?
I think it's the gastric glands. I'm not 100% sure on that, though. There are glands, we don't require that you know the name of them, though. There are glands within the stomach that secrete pepsin, the goal of which is to start breaking down proteins. Okay? So proteins, like we said earlier, are long strings of amino acids. The enzyme pepsin doesn't necessarily bond and break off one amino acid, then bond and break off another amino acid. It'll bond to the middle of the chain, the end of the chains, wherever, and it's just going to break them into smaller hunks. The protein is the long piece. The pepsin enzyme is going to break it up into small hunks. The hunks are known as peptones. Okay? So, at this point, we've broken down our fats, we've broken down our starches in chemical digestion with the amylase. We've broken down our proteins and fats. So at this point, the stomach is, the chyme is going to leave the stomach and enter the small intestine. To leave the stomach, you have to go through the pyloric sphincter. It's right here. So stomach, intestine, the first part of the small intestine, the valve that separates them is the pyloric sphincter. Okay? So it will open to allow the chyme to go through, and then close to make sure that the next batch of food is thoroughly digested by the stomach before it's ready to go in the intestines. Okay? So the first portion of the small intestines that we're going to encounter, this one right here, like we said, the one we were just pointing to, is called the duodenum, or duodenum. If I'm not 100%, I can't keep up with how she pronounces it. So this portion is the first part of the small intestines, and it is very important because it is the site where the majority of nutrient absorption and digestion occurs. If I asked anyone that, you'd say the stomach. The fact of the matter is it's broken down in the stomach, but there's much more of absorption of those nutrients in the duodenum. And there's much more breaking it down because of this. Does everyone see this kind of lumpy looking thing right here? It doesn't look like much. It's not like a thing. It's just like the darker area right here. That's your pancreas. Your pancreas is involved in sending out many different kinds of hormones. I'm sorry, of enzymes. They are dumped into your duodenum in the form of what's called pancreatic juices. Those enzymes are going to start breaking down various things. You have your nucleases, you have your peptidases, you have your lipases, they all are going to break down individual things. So nucleases are DNA and RNA, or break down DNA and RNA. Peptidases break down the smaller peptones that the pepsin already broke down. Then your lipases are going to break down the smaller hunks of fat that the bile broke down. Okay? So remember we said that enzymes are very specific as far as the temperature, pH. pH would be whether it's acidic or basic. What would you say, or how would you describe the stuff that's coming out of the stomach? Would you say it's acidic or basic or neutral? No, it's very acidic. There's hydrochloric acid in the stomach, so the contents are going to have a lot of hydrochloric acid, and they're going to be very acidic when they enter the duodenum. They're so acidic that the enzymes that the pancreas introduces wouldn't be able to work if there wasn't some means of neutralizing the stuff coming out of the stomach. So to neutralize the contents of the stomach as they enter the duodenum, you have what are called duodenal glands or Brunner's glands. You can't really see them, they're on the inside, but they secrete alkaline substances. Alkaline means basic, the opposite of acidic. They secrete alkaline substances that are going to neutralize the chyme to a more normal pH, and then at that point the pancreas is going to dump its enzymes, because at that point they will be able to work. There's no point in wasting the enzymes if you're not ready for them to act. Okay? So at that point the food is going to continue as it's being broken down through the three portions of the small intestine. The first is the duodenum, the second is the jejunum, and then the third is the ileum. Okay, so just a spoiler, there are no real structures. I couldn't point out a spot and tell you this is where the duodenum ends, this is where the jejunum starts. Or at least for this class, we don't worry about that. The middle portion is the jejunum, and either end in proximity to the valves are the duodenum and the ileum. Okay? So it goes through the ileum, or through the duodenum, into the ileum, which would be this right here. This is your ileum. And it continues down. The boundary is kind of arbitrary. At this point, your food is going to leave the small intestine and go into the large intestine. This is your ileum. This is the cecum of the large intestine. The valve, that separates them is the ileocecal valve. The valve that separates the ileum from the cecum is the ileocecal valve. Makes sense. Okay, so why would you need to worry about a valve in between the large and small intestines? What's in the large intestine that you don't want in the small intestine? That's gross. That's a flea.
No.
Bacteria. You know that in your feces and your digestive tract you have lots of things like E. coli and salmonella and other various microbacteria that help break down various parts of your food. The bacteria in your intestines are localized to the large intestine. If they were to get back into the small intestine, they could cause havoc and cause large-scale infection. I'm sorry. The goal of this valve is to make sure that the food gets through the large intestine, but the bacteria don't make their way back through. Okay? Another interesting part about the cecum, or this first little crook of the large intestine, would be where in humans you would find the appendix. Cats don't have an appendix, so there's no appendix here, just so you kind of understand. So at this point, the food is going to enter the large intestine. What is the main thing that happens in the large intestine?
Absorption?
What's that? Yeah. Specifically one thing. So if your large intestine wasn't absorbing properly, you would have diarrhea. Your large intestine is involved in absorbing water. Okay? So you think, why would you care? Why do you bother absorbing that water? Well, because we all live in the world of vending machines and water fountains and stuff, but through evolution, the idea was that water, or fresh water, was expensive. It wasn't very abundant. You want to save all of the water you can. Your large intestine is involved in reabsorbing much of that water so your body can reuse it. Okay? Like we said, you have lots of bacterial populations in the gut. The E. coli and associated bacteria are going to help break down those small hunks of molecules into individual molecules, small enough at this point to where they can be absorbed into the bloodstream and transported to all the cells of your body. Okay? At this point, the food is going to continue down the large intestine and is going to enter the rectum, which is basically the last little pouch of the large intestine, and then continue through the anal sphincter and then be excreted. The anal sphincter is, all sphincters are muscles. You have to have some way to squeeze down and control the opening and closing. The sphincter in the anal sphincter's case is composed of both smooth muscle and skeletal muscle. So voluntary and involuntary muscle. That comes into the idea of why babies have the ability to defecate as soon as they're born. As they grow up, they develop control over it through potty training, and then you are able to decide when you're going to go. The smooth muscle component is what just basically allows an override of, okay, this has to happen. It's going to happen. You better be wearing a diaper. Later on, you have more control over it, and that is more fine-tuned control of the skeletal muscle component of that sphincter, so you can decide when and where, basically. Okay? All right. So one of the things we missed, this guy right here on the cat's left side. Does everyone see how underneath the stomach? Everyone see this? You know what this is? Yeah, this is the spleen. The spleen is involved in draining what are called lymphatic tissue fluids. Okay, it's involved in a lot of immune responses. Like I said, we have sick cats that come in sometime. Last semester we had one where I couldn't find the spleen because it's supposed to look like this, and the spleen was about this big. Just, yeah, that's usually a sign of some systemic infection, or usually worms or something like that. Okay, let me make sure I didn't miss anything. So oral cavity, pharynx is where the nose and mouth holes come together. Your esophagus is the tube that continues down to the stomach. It takes the food from the oral cavity to the stomach. Cardiac sphincter lets the food into the stomach. The rugae, okay, we didn't talk about rugae. Rugae are the folds on the inside of the stomach. So the inside of the stomach isn't necessarily smooth. You can't see it very well in this cat, but just basically think of it as like if the inside of the stomach was made out of like corduroy, basically. Does that make sense? It's to increase the surface area of the stomach, increase the mixing capabilities of the stomach, and increase surface area in general. So your pyloric sphincter lets the food out of the stomach into the duodenum. It's neutralized by the Brunner's glands. The pancreas dumps its enzymes. They do their job, different jobs depending on the enzyme. Continues into the jejunum, into the ileum, through the ileocecal valve, into the cecum of the large intestine, through the large intestine, into the rectum, and out through the anal sphincter. One confusing term that some people mix up all the time is the relationship between large intestine and colon. Your large intestine is your colon. Okay? They're synonymous. All right? So, talked about the pancreas, the liver, the gallbladder, the spleen. Okay, peritoneum. What does the word visceral mean? If someone got eviscerated, what happened? Yeah, so like you'd be cut and your guts come out. Eviscerated, your organs came out. Viscera refers to organs. So your visceral peritoneum is this shiny covering that coats the outside of the organs themselves. So the shiny covering on the liver, on the stomach, on the intestines, on the kidneys, All of that is your visceral peritoneum. Whereas on the outer wall, the parietal, so parietal lobes, refer to your outer lobes of the brain. So the outer walls of the abdominal cavity are going to be lined with parietal peritoneum. Visceral peritoneum is on the organs, parietal peritoneum are on the actual cavity walls. So both the thoracic cavity has its parietal peritoneum and the abdominal cavity has its parietal peritoneum. Okay? So I showed these very quickly, and we're going to go, the next exam has much, much more about kidneys. But just so you can see, this is one kidney, that's another kidney. This is a bladder right here. It's a boy. Does anyone want me to point anything out? Did y'all not see anything? Do you want me to get a good shot with the cameras or something? Something that wasn't clear?
You said the spleen drains lymphatic what?
Lymphatic fluids.
Fluid.
Yeah.
Did you go over greater omentum?
Okay, no, I must have missed that one. So, the greater omentum has largely been removed from this cat. You can kind of see parts of it here. This stuff right here. There's a large flappy sheet of that covers the entirety of the abdominal cavity. It's basically, it's mesentery, which is this clear stuff. The mesentery is also this. See the stuff that holds the intestines together? It's basically fatty mesentery that covers all of the organs and holds them all together. It's like padding for your organs. I think that's it. I think we went over everything. Just to show, I'll give you all a tour while we got the thing open. Yeah, we got a few